The universe operates on principles we understand: physics, chemistry, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. Warp fields bend space. Transporters dissolve matter into energy and reassemble it across impossible distances. Sensors measure, quantify, and catalog everything from subatomic particles to the gravitational pull of dying stars. In the 24th century, humanity had built a civilization on the bedrock of scientific certainty, and the crew of the USS Voyager, stranded 70,000 light-years from home in the Delta Quadrant, clung to that certainty the way a drowning person clings to a rope. Then the rope frayed. It began with the slipstream test. Lieutenant Commander Tuvok had logged his reservations in triplicate. 7 of 9 had run the calculations 11 times, each iteration confirming a 96. 3% probability of successful field coherence. Captain Catherine Janeway had approved the test anyway, because Janeway always approved the tests that might bring her crew home, and because in the Delta Quadrant, the alternative to risk was simply a slower death. The quantum slipstream drive engaged at 0347 hours, ship time. For 4 minutes and 17 seconds, Voyager moved through a corridor of folded space at velocities that made conventional warp look like a shuttlecraft puttering through an asteroid field. The stars outside the viewscreen became something that had no name in the Federation's scientific lexicon, not streaks, not light, but a kind of luminous pressure, as though the universe itself was leaning in. Then the field destabilized. It wasn't catastrophic. 7 had built failsafes into the failsafes. Voyager dropped back into normal space with nothing worse than a plasma relay overload on Deck 7 and a headache for every crew member who hadn't been braced. Ensign Kim was already running diagnostics. Torres had engineering on full alert. Chakotay was reading damage reports from his chair with the practiced calm of a man who had learned to treat near disaster as a routine occurrence. No one was looking at the secondary hull sensors when the anomaly registered. It was Tuvok who caught it, because Tuvok caught everything. A subspace distortion, residual, already collapsing, approximately 340 meters off the port bow. Inside it, tumbling through the last gasps of a fold that had no business existing in normal space, was the fragment of a vessel. Not Federation. Not any configuration in Voyager's database. Roughly 12 meters of hull plating, alloy composition unknown, attached to what appeared to be a life support module that was still, impossibly, drawing power from a source that didn't match any known energy signature. And inside the module, according to sensors that had to be recalibrated twice before anyone would believe the reading, was a single human life sign. Janeway to Transporter Room 2, the captain said, her coffee forgotten. Lock onto that life sign and beam directly to sickbay. Tuvok, I want a full analysis of that hull fragment. Torres, get me whatever you can on that power source. Someone get the doctor online. What materialized on the bio bed in sickbay 17 seconds later was a boy. He appeared to be in his mid-teens, lean, dark-eyed, with close-cropped hair and a stillness about him that seemed less like unconsciousness and more like controlled dormancy. He wore a uniform that the doctor's preliminary scan couldn't place, utilitarian, gray-green, bearing insignia that Voyager's universal translator processed as military rank but couldn't match to any known fleet. His vital signs were stable. Elevated cortisol. Heart rate slightly accelerated even in unconsciousness. No injuries beyond mild hypoxia and what the doctor identified, with a small frown at his own readout, as a pattern of old physical stress markers consistent with years of intensive training. Someone had worked this child very hard for a very long time. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. He regained consciousness 41 seconds after materialization, and the doctor noted, and would later log as remarkable, that there was no disorientation phase. No blinking confusion, no where am I reflex. The boy's eyes opened and immediately began moving. Ceiling. Lighting. Medical equipment. The doctor himself. The single door. The environmental controls on the wall panel. Back to the doctor. The entire survey took approximately 3 seconds. You're not if, the boy said. His voice was quiet, careful, and carried an evaluation in it that the doctor found mildly unsettling given that it was coming from someone who had been unconscious less than a minute ago. I am the emergency medical holographic program, the doctor said, moving toward him with a medical tricorder. You're aboard the Federation starship Voyager. You were recovered from a vessel fragment approximately. What's your defensive capability? The boy asked. Not rudely. The way someone asks what time it is. I beg your pardon. This ship. What's your defensive capability? Are we at risk right now? He was already sitting up, already cataloging the room's dimensions with his eyes. You pulled me out of that module, which means you use some kind of retrieval system, which means you have technology I'm not familiar with. I need to know if whatever followed that transit anomaly can get to me here. The doctor paused his scan. Nothing followed you. You're safe. The boy looked at him for a long moment, and the doctor had the distinct impression that he was being assessed in some way the tricorder couldn't measure. Nobody, the boy said quietly, is ever just safe. Down the corridor, in the captain's ready room, Janeway was reading Tuvok's preliminary report on the hull fragment. The alloy was roughly analogous to late 22nd century human metallurgical techniques. The life support module's power source appeared to be a miniaturized variation on a cold fusion design that predated Starfleet by at least 2 centuries. The insignia on the boy's uniform, cross-referenced against historical Federation databases, returned one partial match. To a period of Earth history that Voyager's records classified as the Formic Wars era. A conflict that, according to those same records, had ended with the total extinction of an alien species. Janeway set down the PADD. She thought about that for a moment. About a boy with a soldier's eyes waking up in her sickbay. About a war that had ended with an entire civilization erased from existence. Then she picked up her coffee, found it cold, and headed to sickbay anyway. Janeway had met prodigies before. Starfleet attracted them the way deep space attracted light, relentlessly, inevitably, and sometimes with consequences nobody had fully thought through. She had served with ensigns who could recalculate warp field geometry in their heads faster than the computer. She had read the file on Wesley Crusher. She had, on one memorable occasion, played 3-dimensional chess against a 12-year-old Vulcan who had beaten her in 11 moves and then politely explained each of her mistakes in chronological order. None of that prepared her for Andrew Wiggin. He was sitting upright on the bio bed when she entered, still in his uniform, the doctor hovering nearby with the expression of a man who has asked his patient to lie down approximately 6 times and intends to ask a 7th. The boy wasn't being difficult. He was simply occupied. His eyes moved to Janeway the moment she crossed the threshold, and she felt, with a certainty she couldn't immediately justify, that he had already assessed her rank, her authority, and at least 2 things she hadn't said yet. Captain, the doctor said, with barely concealed relief. Our guest has been asking questions. I noticed you're carrying a weapon, the boy said to Janeway. Not an accusation. An observation delivered with the neutrality of a sensor reading. Side-mounted, right hip. You came to sickbay armed. That means you're not sure what I am yet. Janeway pulled a chair from the wall, turned it around, and sat on it backwards with her arms folded across the top. She had learned a long time ago that matching someone's energy was frequently more useful than asserting rank over it. Captain Catherine Janeway, she said. USS Voyager, Starfleet. And you're right. I'm not sure what you are yet. She tilted her head slightly. You going to tell me? Something shifted in the boy's face, not quite surprise, but a recalibration. He had expected a different opening. Good, Janeway thought. Let him adjust. Andrew Wiggin, he said. Commander. International Fleet. A pause so brief most people would have missed it. Or I was. How old are you, Andrew? 16. Another pause. Approximately. Relativistic travel makes it complicated. Janeway nodded slowly. The hull fragment we recovered. That was an IF transport vessel. A transit module. I was being moved, relocated, they said. The word carried something underneath it that Janeway filed away for later. There was an anomaly during transit. A fold in something I've never seen in a NAV chart. Then I was here. He looked at her steadily. Where is here, exactly? Your uniform insignia doesn't match any fleet I know, and your ship's power signature is unlike anything in IF engineering. We're in the Delta Quadrant, Janeway said. Approximately 70,000 light-years from Earth. The boy was quiet for 3 full seconds. Janeway watched him process it. Not with panic, not with denial, but with the focused stillness of someone running calculations. What year? He asked. 2374. The number landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Janeway watched the ripples move across his face, controlled, suppressed, but present. She was good at reading people. 20 years of command had made her very good at reading people. What she saw in Andrew Wiggin's eyes in that moment wasn't fear, and it wasn't grief exactly, though it lived in the same neighborhood. It was the expression of someone confirming a suspicion they had hoped was wrong. That's roughly 170 years from my time, he said finally. Give or take, Janeway said. We have historical records from your era. Incomplete ones. She kept her voice even. The Formic Wars. The stillness that moved through him then was different from the stillness before. This one had weight. Then you know, he said. We know what the records say. That humanity fought an alien species across 2 invasions. That a 3rd invasion was repelled. She held his gaze. The records are sparse on the details of how. Sparse, he repeated, quietly, as though testing the word for irony. Janeway made a decision. She had been a captain long enough to know that the next few hours would determine whether this boy became an asset, a liability, or something that didn't fit either category. She also knew, with the instinct that had kept her crew alive in the most hostile quadrant in the known galaxy, that lying to him, or allowing him to believe comfortable half-truths, would be the single fastest way to lose whatever trust was available here. I'd like to show you the ship, she said. Not a tour. A genuine orientation, our situation, our capabilities, our destination. I think you'll understand things faster if you see them rather than if I explain them, and I suspect you prefer it that way. He looked at her for a long moment. Reading her the way she'd been reading him. You want to know what I can do, he said. You're not sure yet whether that's a threat or a resource, and you're smart enough not to decide before you have more information. I'm smart enough, Janeway agreed, to recognize when someone else in the room is also smart enough. For the first time since she'd entered sickbay, something crossed Andrew Wiggin's face that might, in better circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. The doctor cleared his throat. Before any ship tours, I would like to complete my medical evaluation. The patient has been through a significant spatial displacement and I haven't finished. You're a hologram, Ender said, not unkindly. Your medical readings are real, but you're a projected photonic construct with a mobile emitter on your left arm. I've been looking at it since I woke up. He glanced at Janeway. Your ship has holographic technology sophisticated enough to run autonomous programs with full medical training. That's not an any-if research projection for another 3 centuries. The doctor straightened slightly. I am the most advanced. How many crew members are aboard? Ender asked Janeway. 143. How long have you been in the Delta Quadrant? 4 years. And you're still functional. Still disciplined. He looked around the sickbay, at the clean surfaces, the organized equipment, the absence of the institutional decay that crept into isolated military units within 18 months. That's your doing, he said to Janeway. Not flattery. Assessment. Janeway stood, replaced the chair against the wall, and gestured toward the door. Come on, she said. I'll show you the bridge. He slid off the bio bed without hesitation. The doctor made a sound of professional protest that both of them ignored. As they walked into the corridor, Ender's eyes moved continuously. Conduits, junction panels, crew members they passed, sight lines from every intersection. Janeway watched him do it from her peripheral vision and thought of something she hadn't thought about in years, the old Starfleet Academy lectures on threat assessment. The ones that said the most dangerous person in any room was never the one with the most visible weapon. It was the one who had already counted all the exits. Behind them, in the sickbay, the doctor pulled up his diagnostic readout and stared at the psychological stress markers he'd flagged during his preliminary scan. He had served as counselor to a crew of 143 for 4 years. He had seen trauma in many configurations. But the pattern in this boy's neurological baseline was something he needed a word for that wasn't in his medical database. He began composing a message to Captain Janeway marked, after a moment's consideration, urgent. The bridge of Voyager was nothing like battle school. Ender had spent 3 years in a weightless metal sphere, learning to fight in a world where the only constant was that down was a direction you invented for yourself. The enemy's gate is down. That had been his first real lesson, not just about zero-gravity combat, but about the nature of reality itself. Perspective was a choice. Orientation was a weapon. The person who decided what down meant had already won half the battle before the first shot was fired. But this was different. He stood at the back of the bridge and took it in with the same systematic attention he gave every new environment, moving his eyes in the pattern Colonel Graff's training had made instinctive. Entry and exit points first, then weapons or potential weapons, then command hierarchy as expressed through spatial positioning, then the faces of the people who didn't know they were being read. The bridge was circular, layered, built around a central command area with a chair that was clearly the captain's even before Janeway moved toward it. Stations ringed the upper and lower levels: helm, navigation, tactical, operations, science. The view screen at the front dominated the space, currently showing a wide-angle view of open space, distant stars drifting with the slow patience of objects that had existed for billions of years and had no particular investment in the problems of the beings watching them. The crew watched him the way people watch something they haven't decided how to categorize yet. Not hostile. Not welcoming. Alert. A tall Talaxian with spotted skin and an expression of barely contained friendliness was the exception. He gave Ender something that was almost a wave from his station before a look from the Vulcan at the tactical console apparently reminded him that this was not standard protocol for unknown persons on the bridge. Ender catalogued the Vulcan immediately and thoroughly. Security chief, almost certainly. The posture was military in a way that transcended species. Weight balanced, hands positioned for rapid movement, eyes that tracked Ender with the steady non-aggressive focus of someone who had assessed him as a potential threat and had not yet fully downgraded that assessment. The Vulcan's expression was, technically, neutral. But Ender had spent years learning to read the gap between what faces showed and what they meant, and what the Vulcan's face meant was, I have questions about you that logic has not yet resolved, and until it does, I am watching. Ender respected that. Tuvok, Janeway said, this is Andrew Wiggin. Andrew, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok, my Chief of Security. Commander, Tuvok said, with the precise, economic acknowledgement of someone for whom social ritual was a concession to non-Vulcan sensibilities. Your presence aboard this vessel raises several questions I intend to address systematically. I'd expect nothing less, Ender said. Something almost infinitesimal moved in Tuvok's expression. Not surprise. Vulcans didn't do surprise, or at least didn't admit to it. More like a minor recalibration. Lieutenant Paris, Janeway continued, gesturing toward the helm, our chief pilot. Ensign Kim at Ops. Chakotay, my first officer. The broad-shouldered man with the facial tattoo nodded with the measured warmth of someone who had learned to read new arrivals carefully. And 7 of 9, our tertiary adjunct of Unimatrix 01, Ender said. He had been reading the implants for the last 40 seconds. Former Borg drone. Reintegrated. He looked at the woman directly, the implants over her eye, the mesh at her cheekbone, the bearing that was somehow simultaneously rigid and uncertain, like a person still learning the boundaries of their own body. How long? 7 of 9 looked at him with an expression that Ender recognized, because he had worn it himself. It was the expression of someone unaccustomed to being seen clearly by people they had just met. I was severed from the collective 2 years ago, she said. Her voice was precise, carefully modulated, stripped of what she likely considered unnecessary inflection. Do you miss it? He asked. The bridge went very slightly quieter. Janeway didn't intervene. Ender noticed that and noted it in her favor. She was curious how 7 would respond, and she was willing to let an uncomfortable question breathe rather than smooth it over with command authority. That question is irrelevant, 7 said. It isn't, Ender said, not unkindly. But we don't have to talk about it now. He turned back to the view screen. The stars outside had the particular quality of deep space far from any system, no planetary bodies, no navigational markers, just the open, indifferent immensity of a universe that didn't organize itself around human comfort. He had seen stars from battle school's observation windows, but those stars had been distant and theoretical, backdrop to the more immediate geometry of combat drills and launch tube trajectories. These stars felt different. They felt like they were actually there. You said 70,000 light-years from Earth, he said to Janeway. How long at your best sustainable speed? At current projections, approximately 60 years. Ender absorbed this the way he absorbed all operational parameters, not with emotional reaction but with immediate integration into a larger picture. But you're working on alternatives. Constantly. The drive test that caused the fold. That was a slipstream attempt. Janeway glanced at Tuvok, then back at Ender. You understood the energy signature from the sensor readings in the corridor. The readings on the panel we passed on Deck 4. The plasma relay damage pattern was consistent with a field coherence failure in a confined spatial corridor. If engineering had theoretical papers on slipstream geometry, they called it a dead end. He paused. They were looking at it wrong. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room full of intelligent people simultaneously reconsidering something. It was Chakotay who spoke first. What do you mean, looking at it wrong? The coherence failure. Your damage pattern shows it originated at the field's leading edge, not the collar. You were trying to maintain a uniform corridor. Ender moved to the situation table without asking permission, pulling up the sensor display with hands that found the interface intuitively, adapting to the unfamiliar controls with the same effortless recalibration he'd used on every new battle school system. If you treat the slipstream like a tunnel, you'll always lose coherence at the aperture. You need to treat it like a wave. Ride the instability instead of fighting it. He looked up. I'd need to understand your drive mechanics in detail before I could be specific, but the theoretical approach is wrong at the foundational level. The silence again. Longer this time. He's been aboard the ship for 40 minutes, Paris said, to no one in particular. Janeway was looking at Ender with an expression he had seen before, on other faces, in other rooms, and had never entirely learned to be comfortable with. It was the expression of someone recalibrating the scope of what they were dealing with. I'd like to introduce you to B'Elanna Torres, she said carefully. Our chief engineer. Later, Ender said. Then, because he understood command dynamics well enough to know when he'd overstepped, if that's acceptable, Captain. I have a more immediate question. Go ahead. He turned back to the view screen. Your course. The heading you've been maintaining, you're threading between two territorial boundaries. I can infer that from the navigational data on this panel. One of them is a species that uses a specific kind of subspace marker. I don't have a reference for them in anything I know, but the marker pattern is based on a territorial algorithm that's mathematically similar to formic perimeter signals. He looked at Janeway steadily. You're being tracked. Have been for approximately 6 hours, based on the passive scan intervals I can read in your sensor logs. Whatever is out there hasn't moved to intercept, which means it's either waiting for something or it's gathering information. Tuvok was already at his console. 3 seconds of rapid input. Then a pause. He is correct, Tuvok said, and there was something in the Vulcan's voice that Ender suspected was as close to startled as Tuvok permitted himself in public. There are 3 vessels maintaining parallel course at a distance of 4.2 light-years. Their scan patterns have been intermittent and low-powered, below our standard alert threshold. I classified them as background stellar activity. Species 8472, 7 said, moving to her own station. Their long-range reconnaissance configuration. They are observing, not engaging. Their protocol is to assess before committing forces. How long before they commit? Ender asked her. Unknown. Their decision matrix is not fully understood. But you have data on them. Considerable data. Then I'd like to read it, Ender said. All of it. Janeway watched this exchange with the particular attention she reserved for moments when the shape of the future was shifting in ways she couldn't fully see yet. The boy, and she had to keep reminding herself that he was a boy, 16 years old, standing on her bridge with the bearing of a flag officer and the observational precision of a Vulcan, had just done in 40 minutes what her senior staff had not done in 6 hours. He hadn't been trying to impress anyone. He hadn't been performing competence. He had simply been paying attention in a way that made everyone else's attention look like sleep. She thought about Tuvok's preliminary report. About the Formic Wars. About what sparse meant when it was applied to the historical record of a genocide. She thought about what it must be like to be 16 years old and carry that. 7, she said, set Andrew up with full access to our Species 8472 database in astrometrics. Tuvok, I want a full tactical assessment of those 3 vessels on my console within the hour. She looked at Ender. And Andrew, the slipstream theory. Write it up. Whatever you remember from IF research plus whatever you observed in this morning's damage pattern. Don't worry about our engineering format. Just write it the way it makes sense to you. He nodded. Then, after a beat, Captain. The 3 vessels. Have you considered that the reason they haven't engaged yet might not be strategic patience? What else would it be? He looked at the view screen again, at the stars that didn't care about any of them. Fear, he said simply. Something on this ship is frightening them. The question is whether it's the ship itself. He paused, and something moved in his dark eyes that Janeway couldn't name, or whether they detected the fold anomaly and they're trying to determine what came through it. The bridge was very quiet. Outside, 4.2 light-years away, 3 ships that had defeated the Borg held their position and continued to watch. In astrometrics, 2 hours later, Ender sat alone with 6 years of Species 8472 tactical data and read every word of it with the focused, consuming attention of someone who had once read every record of every formic engagement in human history and found, buried in the data, the pattern that won the war. He read for a long time. And gradually, as the data accumulated into shape, his expression changed into something that the astrometric sensors, had anyone been watching, would have recorded simply as stillness. But it wasn't stillness. It was recognition. He had seen this before. Not the species, not the biology, not the technology. But the pattern. The way they moved. The way they probed. The way they tested the edges of a threat before committing. He had seen it in the Formics. He had seen it in himself. His hand moved to the console and began pulling comparative tactical overlays, working quickly and silently in the vast, star-filled room while Voyager moved through a quadrant that had never heard of Andrew Wiggin, toward a confrontation that was already, in ways no one else on the ship had yet understood, inevitable. Tuvok had performed 847 mind melds in his lifetime. The number was precise because Tuvok was precise about everything, and because the mind meld was not, as humans sometimes romanticized it, a mystical communion between souls. It was an act of profound neurological intimacy that carried real risk, demanded real preparation, and left real traces in both participants regardless of how cleanly it was executed. He had melded with colleagues, with suspects, with dying crew members whose final memories needed preservation for the record. He had melded with aliens whose neurological architecture bore almost no resemblance to Vulcan or human physiology. He had melded, once, with a being of pure energy that had left a resonance in his katra that still occasionally surfaced in deep meditation, like a stone lodged in the bed of an otherwise clear stream. He had never melded with anyone like Andrew Wiggin. He had not gone to astrometrics intending to propose it. He had gone because the captain had asked for a tactical assessment of the species 8472 vessels, and because the boy had been in astrometrics for 3 hours with full access to Voyager's most sensitive tactical database, and because Tuvok's professional obligation to the safety of this crew did not pause simply because someone was 16 years old and had already demonstrated perceptual abilities that Tuvok had not yet fully categorized. He had gone to observe. To ask questions. To apply logic to the variable that Andrew Wiggin currently represented in Voyager's operational picture. He had not anticipated what he found. Ender was standing at the central display with 6 tactical overlays running simultaneously, cross-referenced against Voyager's sensor logs from every species 8472 encounter in the database. He had organized the encounters not chronologically, as the database filed them, but by behavioral pattern, grouping engagements by the decision intervals between initial contact and first aggressive action, then by the spatial geometry of approach vectors, then by what Tuvok recognized, with a small and carefully suppressed sense of professional surprise, as a predictive model of species 8472 threat assessment methodology. The boy had been aboard the ship for less than 4 hours. "You've restructured the database," Tuvok said. "I haven't changed anything. I'm running a parallel overlay." Ender didn't look up from the display. "Your filing system organizes by star date. That's useful for historical retrieval. It's not useful for pattern analysis." "And what pattern have you identified?" Now Ender looked up. He studied Tuvok for a moment with those dark, measuring eyes, and Tuvok had the experience, uncommon, and therefore notable, of feeling genuinely assessed rather than merely observed. Species 8472 doesn't engage unless it calculates a victory probability above a specific threshold, Ender said. Your records show 11 encounters. In every case where they initiated combat, the engagement began within a specific decision window after first contact, between 40 minutes and 2 hours. In every case where they didn't engage, the window passed and they withdrew. He gestured at the display. The 3 ships that have been following us have been in contact for 6 hours and 14 minutes. They're past their own engagement threshold, which suggests they have calculated a victory probability below their acceptable threshold, Tuvok said. Or that something has disrupted their calculation and they're recalibrating. Ender held his gaze. Your records also show that species 8472 has never encountered a fold anomaly of the type that brought me here. Their scan intervals on Voyager have been irregular, not in a random way, but in the specific irregular pattern of sensors being redirected. They're not watching the ship. They're watching the region of space where the anomaly occurred. A pause. They're trying to determine if it's a weapon. Tuvok processed this. It was logical. It was also a conclusion that had not appeared in his own tactical assessment, which he had completed 47 minutes ago and which he now found himself retrospectively revising. You have considerable tactical experience, he said. It was not a question. Yes. The historical records we have from your era are incomplete. The International Fleet, classified most of its operational data. Tuvok folded his hands behind his back in the posture he used when he was about to say something that required careful framing. What records we do have indicate that the third invasion was repelled through a strategy of significant complexity, executed under conditions of considerable deception. He paused. The records do not specify the architect of that strategy. Ender's expression didn't change. But something behind it did. A tightening, barely perceptible, like a structure bearing new weight. No, he said. I don't imagine they do. Were you that architect? The silence that followed was long enough that Tuvok began to consider whether the question had been imprecise. Then Ender turned back to the display and made 3 adjustments to the overlay with the focused efficiency of someone redirecting their attention through sheer professional discipline. I was told it was a simulation, he said. Training exercises. The best ones. The final exam. His voice was even and uninflected in the way that Tuvok recognized from his own people, not the natural evenness of someone unaffected, but the practiced evenness of someone who had built a structure around something too large to carry openly. I was 16 years old and I thought I was playing a game and I killed every Formic in existence. A beat. So yes. I was the architect. Tuvok was quiet for a moment. On a Vulcan, quiet was not absence, it was the presence of thought given space to move. That is a considerable weight, he said finally. It is what it is. No, Tuvok said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite gentle but was the closest approximation of gentle that his discipline allowed. It is not merely what it is. It is what it has made you. And those are different things. He moved to stand beside the boy at the display, looking at the tactical overlays rather than at him, which he calculated would make the next part easier. I would like to propose a mind meld. Ender turned to look at him. Not for intelligence purposes, Tuvok said immediately. I want to be precise about that. The captain has not requested it. It is not a security measure. I am proposing it because in 47 years of service I have developed a capacity to recognize when a person is carrying something that has not been properly processed. And because the mind meld, whatever else it is, allows a Vulcan to serve as a kind of ballast. A stable point of reference for a mind under strain. He met the boy's eyes. You have been awake for what I estimate to be approximately 20 hours. You have been displaced across 170 years and 70,000 light-years. You have reorganized a tactical database in 3 hours as a response to stress, because analysis is how you manage fear. And you have not, in the time you have been aboard this vessel, allowed yourself to feel anything directly. The boy stared at him. I'm not afraid, Ender said. No, Tuvok agreed. You are not afraid. You are something considerably more complex than afraid. You are a person who won a war by understanding his enemy better than his enemy understood itself, and who has now arrived in a universe where the enemy you destroyed no longer exists, where the people who used you are 170 years in the past, and where the only available application of your considerable abilities is a new conflict with a new enemy. He paused. You are not afraid. You are wondering if that is all you are. The astrometrics lab was very quiet. The stars on the display turned slowly, indifferent and eternal. You got all of that, Ender said slowly, from watching me reorganize a database. I got all of that, Tuvok said, from watching you not look at the Earth on the navigational chart for 3 hours. It is directly behind you. You have not turned around once. Ender was still for a long moment. Then, with the deliberate movement of someone making a conscious decision rather than a reflexive one, he turned around. Earth was a small blue indicator light on the stellar map, tagged with navigational data and distance markers. 70,000 light-years away. 170 years in the future from everything he had known. The dot that represented the planet where his sister Valentine was probably right now reading something in a garden somewhere, not knowing that her brother had been pulled out of a transit module and deposited in a century that hadn't been born yet. He looked at it for a long time. The mind meld, he said finally. What does it actually feel like? It is different for every participant. For most humans, it is described as a sudden expansion of self. The sensation of another consciousness present within your own, distinct but not invasive. Tuvok considered. For someone of your particular cognitive architecture, I would anticipate it would feel less like expansion and more like, finally having an opponent who can keep up. Something crossed Ender's face then, not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one, the expression of someone who has been surprised into almost finding something funny in a moment that wasn't supposed to contain anything funny. "All right," he said. The meld lasted 14 minutes. Tuvok had estimated, based on his preliminary assessment of Ender's cognitive patterns, that he would encounter a well-organized, highly compartmentalized mind, the kind of mental architecture that strategic thinkers often developed, where information was sorted and filed and accessible but emotions were routed away from the main operational areas into storage. He had expected barriers. He had expected the trained resistance of a military mind accustomed to protecting information. He had not expected the game's room. It was not, of course, a literal room. The mind meld did not produce literal architecture. But human minds organize themselves in metaphorical structures, and what Tuvok found in the deepest layer of Andrew Wiggin's consciousness was something that presented itself as a vast, dark space full of simulations. Tactical scenarios running simultaneously in every direction, each one populated with enemies and variables and decision trees that branched and rebranched into infinite complexity. Ender had been playing games in his own mind continuously, without pause, since before he could name what he was doing. The games were not recreation. They were survival. They were the way he processed a reality that had never, not once in his life, allowed him to simply exist without requiring him to be useful. And at the center of all of it, small and very still, was the thing Tuvok had known would be there. The Formics. Not as enemies. Not as the faceless hive mind antagonists of if propaganda. As presences. Enormous, incomprehensible, and utterly silent, because the mind that had understood them better than any human alive had also understood, in the moment of their destruction, that they had never wanted to fight at all. That the first two invasions had been the formic equivalent of exploring. That they had not understood, could not have understood at the time, that the creatures they were moving through were people. That Andrew Wiggin had destroyed a civilization that, in its own way, had been as innocent as it was dangerous. He carried them with him everywhere. He had carried them since the moment Colonel Graff had told him the truth. They lived in the deepest room of his mind like a debt he had no way to repay, in a currency that no longer existed. Tuvok withdrew from the meld carefully and slowly, the way you withdraw from a room where someone is sleeping, and sat quietly for a moment before he spoke. "Thank you," he said. "For allowing that." Ender opened his eyes. He looked, Tuvok thought, very slightly less like a structure under maximum load. "The species 8472 vessels," Ender said, after a moment. "I want to be present when Janeway decides how to respond to them. I will inform the captain." "And Tuvok?" Ender looked at him directly. "What you saw in there. The things I carry. They are yours," Tuvok said simply. "I am a witness, not a keeper. What I saw does not leave this room." Ender nodded. And then, because he was 16 and had been awake for 20 hours and had just let a Vulcan walk through the most defended territory in his mind, he sat down on the floor of the astrometrics lab with his back against the console and closed his eyes, and for the first time since waking up in sickbay on a ship 70,000 light-years from everything he had ever known, he simply breathed. Outside, the three species 8472 vessels held their position. And waited. Catherine Janeway had a rule about herself that she had never written down and never spoken aloud but had carried through 20 years of command like a compass needle she checked when the stars stopped being reliable. She was allowed to want things, but she was not allowed to let wanting things make her into someone she didn't recognize. She had wanted to get her crew home badly enough to make alliances with the Borg. She had wanted to protect her people badly enough to violate the temporal prime directive twice, bend the prime directive proper on 4 occasions she could count, and once destroy a Starfleet-sanctioned weapons cache rather than let it fall into hands that would use it on civilians. She had wanted things with the fierce, unrelenting hunger of a woman who understood that desire was fuel and that fuel, properly managed, kept you moving across 70,000 light-years of hostile space when logic alone would have told you to stop. But she was standing in her ready room now, looking at a cup of coffee she hadn't touched in 40 minutes, and she was watching herself want something in a way that made her compass needle swing. She wanted to use him. The thought was clear and honest, and she didn't flinch from it, because Janeway's relationship with uncomfortable truths was the same as her relationship with black coffee. She took them straight and without apology. Andrew Wiggin had been aboard her ship for 11 hours. In those 11 hours he had identified a species 8472 surveillance pattern her senior staff had missed for 6 hours, proposed a theoretical correction to the slipstream drive geometry that B'Elanna Torres had spent 40 minutes reviewing before coming to her captain with an expression that mixed professional excitement with something that looked uncomfortably like awe. And apparently undergone a voluntary mind meld with Tuvok that Tuvok had logged with the single most remarkable understatement Janeway had read in 4 years of his reports. Subject displays cognitive architecture of significant strategic complexity. Recommend continued observation. Personal note, the meld was illuminating in ways I am still processing. Tuvok processed things in his sleep. Tuvok had meditated his way through a Borg incursion without elevating his heart rate. The fact that he was still processing anything 11 hours after the fact meant that whatever he had found in Andrew Wiggin's mind had not fit into any existing category he had available. And now the species 8472 vessels were moving. Not toward Voyager. Parallel course, closing the distance incrementally, in the specific patient geometry that Seven had identified as pre-engagement assessment behavior. They had approximately 18 hours, by Seven's estimate, before the 3 ships completed their calculation and committed to a decision. The decision would be either withdrawal or attack, and the variables that determined which one were not fully understood and had never, in any of Voyager's encounters with species 8472, been successfully influenced by anything Janeway had tried. She had tried diplomacy once. It had nearly destroyed the ship. She had tried avoiding engagement twice. They had followed anyway. She had tried demonstrating defensive capability. It had accelerated the timeline. Ender had spent 2 hours in astrometrics after the mind meld, running simulations she hadn't authorized but hadn't stopped, because Torres had called her from engineering at the 90-minute mark and said, "Captain, I don't know who this kid is, but he just sent me a slipstream field correction that solves a problem I've been working on for 8 months, and I think you should know that, because it means whatever else he is." His spatial mechanics intuition is not something I can explain with normal human cognitive ability. Normal human cognitive ability. As though there had ever been anything normal about Andrew Wiggin. She had pulled his file from the historical database again after Torres's call. Not the sparse official record, that she had already read twice. She had gone deeper, into the fragmentary of documents that Federation archivists had reconstructed from the period, the pieces that had survived 2 centuries and the deliberate information suppression of an organization that had understood, even in the moment of its greatest victory, that the truth of what it had done was not something it wanted in the historical record. They had taken him at 6. Monitored him since birth. Designed him, essentially. His parents had been granted a rare license for a 3rd child specifically because the IF's genetic model suggested the combination of his siblings' traits might produce something that didn't exist yet. They had watched him, tested him, manipulated him, isolated him, put him in environments of escalating cruelty to see if he would break, and when he didn't break they had done it again with more cruelty and more isolation, because they needed to know exactly how much he could carry before they put the weight of the world on him. And when they had finally determined that he could carry everything they needed him to carry, they had handed him a command interface for the largest military fleet in human history and told him it was a game. Graph. Rackham. The entire if command structure. They had looked at a child and seen a weapon, and they had spent a decade sharpening him, and when they were done they had pointed him at an alien civilization and let him pull the trigger without ever telling him that the trigger was real. She put the coffee down and stood up. She had been thinking about this for 11 hours because she needed to think about it clearly before she walked into the conversation she was about to have. She needed to know exactly where she stood. She needed her compass needle steady. She found him in holodeck 2. He hadn't requested access. Janeway had authorized it proactively, instructing the computer to offer him the holodeck when his astrometric session ended, because Torres had told her he hadn't eaten since waking up and she suspected he wouldn't eat unless given a reason to stop working, and she was right. He had, apparently, asked the computer for a room with variable gravity and then spent 90 minutes in zero-G configurations that the holodeck's motion sensors had logged as combat training drills, unlike any pattern in Starfleet's physical training database. When she entered, he was sitting in the center of a room he had configured as simple open space, no furniture, no simulation, just a neutral gray environment with the gravity set to approximately 60% standard. He was eating a replicated meal that he had clearly requested without much interest in what it was, working through it with the mechanical efficiency of someone who understood nutrition as a maintenance requirement rather than a pleasure. He looked up when she entered. The assessment happened again. The rapid scan, the categorization. Then he set down the fork with a kind of deliberate courtesy that she was beginning to recognize as his version of social signaling. I see you, I'm paying attention, I'm choosing to make that visible. Captain, he said. She sat down on the floor across from him, which she could tell surprised him by the fractional pause before he recalibrated. Good. She needed him off balance enough to be honest. I want to have a conversation with you, she said, and I want to have it without rank in the room. Is that possible? He considered this. Rank doesn't leave a room just because you say it does. No. But the pretense that it doesn't exist can be useful sometimes. She looked at him steadily. I've been reading about you. The historical record. What's in our database about the IF and the Formic Wars? The thing that happened to his expression was controlled and swift, but she had been watching for it. Then you know more than I'd probably choose to tell you. I know what they did with you, she said. I know how they built you, and what they built you for, and what they told you while they did it. She paused. I want you to know that I understand the difference between a weapon and the person who was made into one. And I want you to know that before I say what I'm about to say, because what I'm about to say could sound like I'm doing the same thing they did, and I need you to be able to tell the difference. He was very still. Eating forgotten. Full attention on her in the focused, unblinking way that she suspected was his version of being completely present. The species 8472 vessels, she said. 18 hours. I have a crew of 143 people who have been away from home for 4 years and who are, despite everything, still intact, still functioning, still pointing themselves toward Earth with everything they have. I will not lose them to a species I've never been able to communicate with, in a quadrant I was never supposed to be in, on a heading that should be taking them home. She held his gaze. I'm going to ask you to help me. Not because you're a weapon and I need to point you at something. Because you looked at 6 years of species 8472 data this morning and you saw something in 3 hours that my best people hadn't seen in 3 years, and because whatever is in that data, I think you might be able to see a way through this that doesn't require anyone to die. The silence lasted long enough that she counted it. 11 seconds. Graf said something like that to me once, Ender said quietly. Not those words. But the same shape. The same, he searched for the word, honesty about need. Graf was always honest about what he needed. He just wasn't honest about the cost. I know, Janeway said. And I'm not going to pretend the situations are equivalent, because they're not. You're not a child being shaped by an institution that has owned you since birth, and I'm not an admiral building a civilization's survival strategy around a miner. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't need your help, because I do, and pretending otherwise would be an insult to both of us. She kept her voice level and her eyes steady. So I'm asking. Not ordering. Asking. With full disclosure of what I'm asking for and why. Ender looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at his half-eaten meal, then out at the neutral gray holodeck walls, then back at her. The pattern I found in the data, he said. Species 8472. The decision interval between assessment and engagement. I think it's not a tactical calculation. I think it's a communication protocol. Janeway leaned forward slightly, involuntarily. Their scan patterns aren't surveillance, he continued. They're questions. The irregular intervals I identified, the redirected sensors, they're not gathering tactical data. They're waiting for a response. A specific kind of response. He looked at her with the expression of someone working through a conclusion that was still forming. They've encountered Voyager before. Multiple times. Every time, the response they've received has been either hostility or withdrawal. Neither of those is an answer to the question they're asking. He paused. I think they want to know what this ship is. What it represents. Whether it's a forward element of something larger or whether it's genuinely alone. How do you tell a species you can't communicate with that you're alone? You don't tell them, Ender said. You show them. In a language they already have. He picked up his fork, looked at it, set it down again. The fold anomaly. The slipstream failure that brought me here. They've been scanning that region of space for 6 hours because it looked, to their sensors, like a weapon being tested. A dimensional weapon. Something that could fold space as an offensive capability. He met her eyes. What if we reproduced the anomaly? Deliberately. Not as a weapon test. But in a configuration that their own territorial signal algorithms would classify as, a door being opened. An invitation. The mathematical equivalent of showing your hands. Janeway stared at him. You want to use the slipstream drive, she said slowly, to send a message in a language built from their own territorial mathematics. I want to use the residual fold signature from this morning's test, modulated through your deflector array, to reproduce a pattern that their own scanning algorithm will classify as non-threatening. It's not a universal translator solution. It's a tactical one. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes. You asked me to find a way through this that doesn't require anyone to die. That's what I found. Janeway was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about compass needles and about the difference between weapons and people and about a boy who had been built to destroy and who, when given 18 hours and a database and a question, had looked for a door instead of a gun. Walk me through the math, she said. And he did. The mathematics took 4 hours. Not because Ender worked slowly, Janeway had already stopped making assumptions about the speed at which Andrew Wiggin worked, but because the problem was genuinely complex in ways that required the kind of collaborative iteration that couldn't be rushed without producing errors, and because errors in this particular calculation would not result in a failed experiment. They would result in a provocation that 3 ships carrying weapons capable of cutting through Borg cubes like paper would interpret as a declaration of war. Janeway had called Torres and Seven to the main briefing room at 1400 hours and watched the 3 of them work around a central table with the focused, almost architectural quality of people who had stopped being aware of the room they were in. Torres had arrived skeptical in the specific combative way that meant she was interested. B'Elanna's skepticism was always loudest when something was compelling enough to threaten her existing framework, and Ender's proposal had apparently threatened several frameworks simultaneously. Seven had arrived with her hands folded and her expression calibrated to professional neutrality, which Janeway had learned to read as Seven's version of acute curiosity. Tuvok sat at the far end of the table saying very little and observing everything, occasionally offering a precision correction to a calculation in a tone that suggested he had already run the numbers independently and was simply waiting for everyone else to arrive at the same place. Chakotay sat beside Janeway and watched it happen with the expression he wore when he was trying to determine whether something was remarkable or alarming and hadn't finished deciding. He's 16, he said quietly, leaning toward her at one point when the 3 at the table were deep in a technical exchange that had temporarily outpaced everyone else's ability to follow. I know, Janeway said. He's restructuring our entire approach to Species 8472 contact based on 11 hours of database access and a pattern recognition capability that I don't have a framework for. I know that too. Chakotay was quiet for a moment. Are you going to tell me what you're thinking? I'm thinking, Janeway said, watching Ender lean across the table to redirect Torres's attention to a specific variable in the deflector modulation sequence, his voice patient and precise in the way of someone who has explained complex things to skeptical people many times before, that they have spent 10 years building a mind capable of winning an unwinnable war, and then they used it and discarded it, and the universe apparently decided that wasn't acceptable. And I'm thinking that whatever brought him here, I have a responsibility to make sure the next thing that happens to him is something he chooses. She picked up her coffee. And I'm thinking that if this works, we might solve a problem that has nearly killed us 3 times and wasted 6 years of tactical planning, and that would be very good for my crew. And if it doesn't work, then we have 14 hours to come up with something else. She drank her coffee. Which is why I'm not stopping them. The proposal, as Ender had outlined it and as it was now being refined through the combined expertise of Torres's engineering knowledge, Seven's Borg-enhanced understanding of species 8472 physiology and technology, and Tuvok's tactical mathematics, was elegant in the way that the best solutions were always elegant. Not simple, because the problem wasn't simple, but inevitable feeling once you saw it, like a proof that makes you wonder why you ever tried to solve it any other way. Species 8472's territorial scanning algorithm, as Seven had documented through years of Borg collective data, operated on a base 12 mathematical structure derived from their own biology. They had 12-lobed brains, 12 primary neural clusters, and their entire spatial reasoning architecture was organized around duodecimal patterns. Their territorial markers, the subspace signals they used to delineate controlled space from open space, were expressed in modulated subspace frequencies arranged in base 12 geometric progressions. It was, Seven had explained during the first Voyager encounter with the species, like a language built entirely from the same mathematical foundation as their nervous system. They didn't choose to think in base 12. They were base 12, all the way down. What Ender had identified in the 6 years of contact data was that the irregular scanning patterns the 3 vessels had been using since the slipstream anomaly were themselves organized in a base 12 structure, not randomly irregular, but specifically irregular in a pattern that repeated with the fractal consistency of a signal carrying intentional information. They weren't just scanning. They were transmitting. Something that, in the wrong hands or at larger scale, could be used to breach the dimensional barrier they had fled through after their conflict with the Borg, the barrier between fluidic space and normal space that was the closest thing species 8472 had to a home border. They were frightened. Ender had been right about that. And frightened apex predators with 12-lobed brains and weapons that could slice through Borg cubes did not become less dangerous when their fear was ignored. The solution used the residual tachyon signature from the morning slipstream test, still faintly detectable in the region of space where the fold had collapsed, as a carrier frequency. Modulated through Voyager's main deflector in a precisely timed sequence, it would reproduce a spatial distortion pattern that matched the territorial algorithm's base 12 grammar in a specific configuration that Seven identified, after 40 minutes of cross-referencing Borg contact data, as a non-territorial marker. Not we are here and this is ours. Not we are powerful and you should withdraw. The mathematical equivalent, as close as they could approximate it, of we are passing through and we mean no disruption and we carry no weapons aimed at your border. The difficulty was the timing. The deflector modulation had to be precise to within a margin of error that Torres kept describing as insane, because the base 12 pattern required 12 simultaneous frequency adjustments in a sequence that lasted 0.4 seconds, and any deviation above 0.003% in any of the 12 would corrupt the signal into something that read, in species 8472's mathematical grammar, as territorial aggression. Specifically, as a claim of ownership over the region of space the fold anomaly had occupied. Which would be, Torres had said, flatly and without elaboration, very bad. The 4 hours were spent building the modulation program with the kind of obsessive precision that Janeway associated with her best engineers and her best tactical officers, which were usually different people. It was unusual to watch someone operate simultaneously in both registers, moving from deflector geometry to signal linguistics to tactical risk assessment and back again without the cognitive shifting of gears that most people needed between disciplines. Ender moved through it all in one continuous motion, the way a musician moves through a complex piece, each element informing the others, the whole thing held in his mind as a single integrated structure rather than a sequence of separate problems. At one point Torres stopped typing, sat back, and stared at him. "How are you doing that?" she demanded. He looked up. "Doing what?" "The frequency sequencing. You're running the base, 12 modulation and the tachyon carrier calibration simultaneously in your head. I have a PhD and a degree in plasma engineering and I can't do that simultaneously." Ender looked at her with an expression that suggested he had genuinely not noticed he was doing anything unusual. "I've been running multiple simultaneous tactical simulations since I was 8, he said. "It's just pattern management. You learn to hold parallel threads." Torres looked at Janeway. Janeway looked back with an expression that said she understood Torres's reaction completely and had been having it for several hours already. "The program is ready," Seven announced, from her position at the far end of the table where she had been running final verification checks with the methodical completeness of someone who had once been part of a consciousness that processed 11 trillion calculations per second and had retained the habit of thoroughness. Modulation sequence is within acceptable error margins. Deflector array is currently at 97.3% efficiency following this morning's test, which introduces a 0.0019% variance in the carrier frequency that I have compensated for in the timing algorithm. She looked at Ender. The compensation introduces a 0.8-second extension to the transmission window. I want to confirm this does not affect the grammatical integrity of the signal. Ender had already been running the numbers. It doesn't. The base 12 structure has redundancy built into the timing intervals. They're biological in origin, which means they have the natural variance tolerance of a neurological signal rather than a mechanical one. 0.8 seconds is within tolerance. Seven regarded him for a moment with the focused, unblinking attention she typically reserved for tactical data she was finding unexpectedly interesting. "You derived species 8472's signal tolerance parameters from first principles," she said. "Without access to the Borg Collective xenobiological database. I inferred them from the variance patterns in the contact data. If the signal were mechanically precise, the irregular scan intervals would have a different distribution. The irregularity itself tells you how much tolerance the system has built in." He paused, then looked at her directly. "The same way you can tell how much error tolerance a person has by how they respond when things don't go exactly as planned." Something moved in Seven's expression, that specific quality of recognition that Janeway had learned to watch for in her, the moments when the carefully reconstructed human in her encountered something that resonated with the parts of her she was still discovering. "You are describing adaptive systems," Seven said. "Biological rather than mechanical. Tolerance built from necessity rather than design." "Yes. I understand that," Seven said. And the way she said it made clear that she was not speaking only about species 8472. Janeway called the bridge at 1847 hours. "Tom, put us on a course that holds our current distance from the 8472 vessels and keeps us parallel to their heading. No aggressive maneuvers, no sudden course changes. Tuvok, I want shields on standby but not raised. Raising shields will read as threat posturing. 7. I need the deflector array ready for a non-standard modulation sequence on my mark." She looked around the briefing room table. "This is going to work or it's going to escalate faster than anything we've faced since the Borg. I want everyone at their stations and I want solutions ready for both outcomes." She looked at Ender last. He was standing with his hands at his sides, watching her with the expression of a person who had built something and was now watching someone else decide whether to use it, which was, she thought, probably a feeling he knew intimately and had complicated feelings about. "You should be on the bridge for this," she said. He nodded. "I know. They walked together through the corridor, the ship humming around them with the particular quality of controlled readiness, the sound of a crew that knew something was coming and had decided to be ready for it rather than afraid of it. Crew members they passed moved with purpose. No one ran. The discipline was remarkable and Janeway knew it and was proud of it in the way she was proud of everything this crew had built out here in the dark, 70,000 light-years from anyone who would have noticed if they'd simply stopped. On the bridge, the view screen showed open space and the navigational indicator marking the 3 species 8472 vessels at 4.2 light-years. As they watched, the distance ticked down. 4.19, 4.17. 4.14. They were accelerating. Slowly, steadily, with the patient geometric precision of something that had decided. They've made their calculation, Tuvok said. Based on their current acceleration rate, engagement threshold will be reached in approximately 4 hours and 17 minutes. Janeway settled into her command chair. Ender took a position at the secondary science console that Janeway had quietly configured for him an hour ago, which he noticed without commenting on. 7, Janeway said. On my mark. She looked at the view screen. At the stars. At the indicator lights moving steadily toward each other in the darkness between them. She thought about what Ender had said in the holodeck. The mathematical equivalent of showing your hands. She thought about a boy who had been built to destroy and who had spent his first day aboard her ship looking for a door. Mark, she said. The deflector array pulsed once, a sequence so brief and precisely calibrated that it registered on the bridge sensors as a flicker rather than a transmission. In the space between Voyager and the 3 approaching vessels, a modulated tachyon pattern bloomed and collapsed in 1.2 seconds, its base, 12 geometric structure propagating outward at the speed of light toward sensors that had evolved over millions of years to read exactly this kind of signal. The bridge waited. The distance indicators held. 3.98 light-years. Still closing, but no longer accelerating. Then, so subtly that Kim almost missed it on his console, the 3 vessels changed course. Not toward Voyager. Not away. Perpendicular. A lateral drift that carried them out of the intercept geometry with the smooth, unhurried movement of something that had received an answer to a question and was now deciding what to do with it. They're holding position, Kim said, and couldn't quite keep the disbelief out of his voice. Sir, they've stopped accelerating. They're holding position at 3.94 light-years. The bridge was very quiet. Janeway looked at the view screen for a long moment. Then she looked at Ender. He was watching the sensor display with the expression of a person checking a calculation they were fairly confident in but wanted to verify. When the numbers confirmed what the sensors showed, something in his shoulders released, a tension so habitual he probably didn't know it was there, a held breath that had been held for a very long time. It worked, Paris said, from the helm, with the specific intonation of a man who will be telling this story for the rest of his life. For now, Ender said. He looked at Janeway. They've received the signal. They know we understand their grammar. That buys time, but it doesn't buy resolution. They'll want more than a handshake. He looked back at the display. They'll want to know if we can actually speak the language or if that was the only word we know. Janeway absorbed this. Then she nodded, slowly, with the expression of someone who has solved one problem and can already see the shape of the next 3. Then we'd better learn more words, she said. The Borg knew everything. That was not hyperbole or mythology, though it had become both in the decades since humanity's first encounter with the collective. It was a functional operational reality that every Starfleet officer who had ever faced a Borg cube understood in the specific visceral way you understood things that had tried to kill you. The Borg knew because they remembered everything they had ever assimilated, and they had assimilated a very great deal. They knew the tactical frequencies of every Federation starship class. They knew the modulation patterns of Starfleet shields, the variance tolerances of phaser arrays, the structural weak points of every hull configuration in the Alpha and Beta quadrants. They knew the biological architecture of 4,000 species and the psychological pressure points of several hundred. They knew, in the cold comprehensive way of a library that never forgot anything and never stopped adding to its collection, essentially everything that had ever been known by anything they had ever absorbed. They did not know about Andrew Wiggin. This was, in the grand calculus of things that could save your life in the Delta Quadrant, significant. The cube dropped out of warp at 0214 hours, 3 days after the species 8472 encounter, emerging from a region of space that Voyager's long-range sensors had flagged as a Borg transit corridor but which had shown no activity for 11 days. It appeared on Kim's console as a sudden massive sensor return, the specific geometric signature of a Borg cube unmistakable in the way that a wall is unmistakable when you walk into one, and the red alert klaxon brought the crew from their sleep cycles to their stations with the practiced urgency of people who had drilled this scenario until it lived in their reflexes rather than their conscious minds. Janeway was on the bridge in 40 seconds. Tuvok in 38. Not pursuit, not patrol, but the specific vector of a vessel that had identified a target and was moving to acquire it. The communications array lit up with the signal that no crew in the Federation ever heard without feeling something cold move through them regardless of how many times they had heard it before. We are the Borg. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Resistance is futile. Red alert, Janeway said, unnecessarily since the klaxon was already doing that, but the words were a ritual and rituals mattered. Tuvok, shields up. Tom, evasive pattern Delta. 7. I need everything you have on this cube's configuration, drone count, tactical array, any identifying markers that tell us which section of the collective we're dealing with. 7 was already working. The cube is a Type 04 tactical configuration. Approximately 64,000 drones. Weapons array consistent with standard Borg armament for this region of the Delta Quadrant. There are no identifying markers in the conventional sense, the Borg do not individuate their vessels. She paused, a fraction of a second longer than her standard processing interval, which Janeway had learned to read as 7 encountering something unexpected. However, there is an anomaly in the hailing signal. Define anomaly, Janeway said. The standard assimilation broadcast is a generalized transmission aimed at all biological and technological entities within range. This transmission is, another fractional pause, targeted. It is specifically addressed to Voyager's hull registry identifier and to a secondary biosignature tag that is not in my records as a standard Starfleet identifier. She looked up. The secondary tag matches the biosignature profile of Andrew Wiggin. The bridge went very quiet in the way that bridges went quiet when the nature of the threat had just changed into something with a different shape than the one everyone had been prepared for. Janeway turned to look at Ender. He was already looking at her. His expression was calm with the specific quality of calm that she had come to recognize in him over 3 days, not the absence of reaction but the presence of a mind moving so quickly through implications that the surface stayed still while everything underneath was in motion. They know I'm here, he said. Apparently. How long have they known? Unknown, 7 said. The collective's information propagation is effectively instantaneous across connected vessels. If any drone within sensor range detected the fold anomaly that brought you aboard, the information would have been distributed immediately. She considered. Given the anomaly's tachyon signature and the slipstream field residuals, any Borg vessel within 12 light-years at the time of the event would have logged it. There are 3 Borg transit corridors within that range. So they've known since I arrived, Ender said. Yes. He turned back to his console. Janeway watched him run something, a simulation, by the look of the display geometry, though it was moving too fast for her to follow the specific parameters. Captain, he said, without looking up. I need to tell you something about how the Borg think. Now would be good, she said, because the cube was at 1.8 light-years and closing. The Borg assimilate for 2 reasons, he said, his voice carrying the brisk precision of a briefing officer, information delivered in the compressed form of someone who knows exactly how much time they have. Technological acquisition and biological distinctiveness. When they encounter something new, they want both the technology and the biology because the combination produces capabilities the collective doesn't already have. For most species, the technology and the biology are separate. You can analyze one without absorbing the other. He brought up a new overlay on his console. But what they've tagged in my biosignature isn't my biology. It's a pattern in my neurological activity. They've identified something in my cognitive architecture that they want, and they've identified it from sensor range without direct contact, which means whatever it is registers as a measurable electromagnetic anomaly in my brain activity. Torres, from engineering via combadge, had been listening. What kind of anomaly? The kind that comes from running parallel tactical simulations continuously, Ender said. The Borg have assimilated thousands of tactical officers. They know what a strategic mind looks like on a biosensor. What they haven't seen is whatever I am, because whatever I am wasn't supposed to exist until the if made it exist, and the if existed 170 years before the Borg made first contact with humanity. He looked at Janeway. They don't want to assimilate Voyager. They want to assimilate me specifically. The ship is incidental to the objective. Janeway absorbed this. Which means their tactical approach to this engagement is going to be different from standard Borg acquisition protocol. They won't prioritize disabling Voyager's weapons. They'll prioritize disabling life support on the decks where I'm located, which forces an evacuation that makes extraction easier. Or they'll target the transporters to prevent beam-out. Or, he paused, running the simulation forward. They'll do what the data suggests they actually will do, which is attempt a targeted transport directly through our shields by modulating their transporter frequency to match the residual tachyon signature from the fold anomaly. Tuvok looked up from his console. Explain. The fold that brought me here left a residual tachyon pattern in my biosignature. A faint one, but measurable. The Borg have been analyzing it for 3 days. If they can modulate their transporter carrier wave to that specific tachyon frequency, it creates a resonance pathway through our shields that doesn't require them to drop our defenses first. He looked at Tuvok. They can beam me out while our shields are fully raised. The silence that followed was the silence of a senior staff simultaneously realizing that the tactical situation was worse than they had assessed and that they were hearing about it from a teenager who had been aboard the ship for 72 hours. Can we block it? Janeway asked. Yes. But not by adjusting the shields. The resonance pathway is in my biosignature, not the shields. You'd have to change the tachyon pattern in my body. He paused. The doctor can do it. A targeted chronoton field pulse through the medical bay's biobed emitters would scatter the residual tachyon pattern and close the pathway. It'll take about 40 minutes and I'll need to be in sickbay for all of it, which means I'm off the bridge when you need me most. Janeway looked at him for a long moment. The cube was at 1.4 light-years. Or, Ender said, and there was something in the way he said the word that made everyone on the bridge look at him, we don't close the pathway. Explain that thought very carefully, Chakotay said. The Borg are coming for me specifically because of what I can do. What I can do is understand how an enemy thinks well enough to find the pattern in their behavior that they don't know is a pattern. He met Janeway's eyes steadily. I've been reading Borg tactical data for 3 days. Not because I thought we'd encounter them this soon, because they're in the database and I read everything in the database. And I found something. He pulled up a new display, and the bridge crew leaned in despite themselves. The Borg adapt. Everyone knows that. What everyone treats as a fixed operational fact is that they adapt to weapons. Phaser frequencies, torpedo yields, shield modulations. But the data shows something else. Something that Seven's institutional knowledge of the collective should confirm. He looked at Seven. The Borg adapt to weapons. They do not adapt to decisions. 7 was very still. Elaborate, she said, and her voice had a quality in it that Janeway had never heard before, the quality of someone who knows what's coming and is waiting to hear it said aloud by someone who arrived at it independently. Every Borg engagement in your database shows adaptive response to every weapon system used against them. Phaser frequencies are adapted within seconds. Torpedo yields within minutes. Novel energy weapons within hours. But look at the decision data. He gestured at the overlay. When Voyager has survived Borg encounters, it hasn't been because your weapons penetrated their adaptations. It's been because someone made a decision they couldn't predict. Janeway reversing course and offering an alliance against Species 8472. Janeway destroying the transwarp hub instead of using it to get home. The Doctor infecting the collective with a neurolytic pathogen through the Borg Queen. He looked at her. None of those were weapon solutions. They were decision solutions. And the Borg have never once adapted their behavior in response to a decision they didn't anticipate, because they can't. The collective processes information about what is happening. It cannot process information about what might happen if someone chooses differently than predicted. You're describing a gap in their adaptive matrix, Tuvok said. I'm describing the same gap that existed in the Formic command structure, Ender said. The Formics communicated through a hive mind. They were brilliant tactically. They could respond to anything in real time across their entire fleet simultaneously. But they could not anticipate a commander who would sacrifice everything to win in a way that looked, from outside, like losing. He paused. The Borg Queen coordinates the collective. She is not a hive mind in the Formic sense, she is an individual consciousness providing direction to a networked whole. Which means she has the gap that all individual consciousnesses have. He looked at the view screen, where the Borg cube was now close enough that its geometric mass was visible as a shape against the stars. She models behavior based on historical data. She predicts based on patterns. And I am a pattern she has never seen before, which means every prediction she makes about me will be wrong, and she will not know it is wrong until it is too late to adapt. Janeway looked at him for a long moment. The cube was at 0.9 light-years and the bridge was humming with the specific vibration of shields at full power and weapons arrays charged and a crew ready for the worst. You want to let them try to take you, she said. I want to let them try, Ender agreed. And I want to be the one who decides what happens when they do. The moment stretched between them, captain and strategist, two people who understood the weight of decisions made in rooms where time was running out, looking at each other across 70,000 light-years of shared displacement and 3 days of something that had not yet been named but was already real. What do you need? Janeway said. 7, he said immediately. I need 7 with me. She knows the collective's decision architecture from the inside. I know how to find the gap. Together we can map an approach in the time we have. He paused. And I need you to trust me, Captain. Not because I've earned it yet. Because there isn't time to earn it and we both know it. Janeway looked at the view screen. At the cube. At the stars behind it that had been there for billions of years and would be there long after every decision made in this moment had played out into consequence. She thought about Graph. About what it meant to trust someone with something this large. About the difference between using a weapon and trusting a person. 7, she said, go with him. Tuvok, maintain defensive posture but do not fire unless I give the order. Tom, keep us moving. Standard evasive, nothing aggressive. She stood from her command chair and faced the view screen as the cube filled it, enormous and geometric and utterly certain of itself in the way that things without doubt were always certain. And Andrew. She didn't look away from the screen. Come back. He was already moving toward the turbolift with 7 beside him, and Janeway heard, just before the doors closed, something she would think about for a long time afterward. Not words exactly, but the sound of someone who had spent their entire life being aimed at things finally choosing, for the first time, their own direction. The Borg Queen was not a single point of consciousness. This was the fundamental misunderstanding that most species made when they encountered her, and it was a misunderstanding she had never bothered to correct because misunderstandings about the nature of your enemy were tactically useful and the Borg were nothing if not tactical. She was not a queen in the biological sense. Not a singular organism sitting at the center of a hierarchy, issuing commands that traveled down a chain of authority to be executed by lesser beings. She was a focal point. A place where the collective's distributed consciousness gathered itself into something that could interface with the individuated minds it encountered, because individuated minds needed to experience her as a person in order to be properly frightened, and properly frightened minds assimilated more cleanly than defiant ones. She was, in the truest sense, everywhere the collective was. Which meant she was aware of Andrew Wiggin the moment her cube dropped out of warp and her sensors resolved his biosignature from the background noise of Voyager's crew of 143. She had been aware of him, in a more diffuse sense, for 3 days. The fold anomaly had registered across 11 Borg vessels simultaneously at the moment of its collapse, propagating through the collective's shared awareness with the specific quality of information that had no existing category, and information without category was, to the Borg, the most interesting kind of information there was. They had analyzed the residual tachyon signature, the dimensional displacement vectors, the biological profile of the single human organism that had arrived through the fold with the specific neurological pattern that the collective's tactical assessment algorithms had flagged, cross-referenced across 4,000 assimilated species, as unprecedented. Not superior in the way that raw processing power was superior. Not enhanced in the way that augmented humans or genetically engineered species were enhanced. Something else. Something that the collective's modeling systems, which could predict the tactical behavior of most species with accuracy margins above 99.7%, kept producing anomalous outputs for when they attempted to project forward from his behavioral data. He was, in the collective's operational language, unpredictable. The Borg did not find many things unpredictable. The list was short and distinguished. Species 8472, whose biology existed outside normal space and whose decision matrix operated on principles the collective had not yet fully reverse-engineered. The Q, who existed outside causality and were therefore definitionally beyond prediction. And now, apparently, a 16-year-old human from a timeline that had not yet occurred, whose mind generated tactical simulations at a rate and complexity that the collective sensor arrays could detect as a measurable electromagnetic phenomenon from a distance of 2.3 light-years. The Queen wanted that mind. Not the biology. Human biology was thoroughly catalogued, offering nothing new. Not the technology. The IF's engineering was primitive compared to 24th century Federation standards, let alone Borg technology. The mind itself. The specific cognitive architecture that produced unpredictability as a natural output rather than a random one. Because unpredictability, properly understood and integrated into the collective's decision matrix, would close the one gap that had allowed individuated species to survive encounters with the Borg when by every logical measure they should not have. She had not shared this reasoning with the cube's tactical drones, because tactical drones didn't need reasoning. They needed directives. The directive was simple: acquire the organism. The reasoning was hers. She had also, with the particular long-range patience that was her specific contribution to the collective's otherwise present-tense consciousness, anticipated that the organism would know she was coming. That he would have read Voyager's Borg tactical database. That he would have found things in it that others had missed. She had factored this into her approach, and her conclusion had been that it changed nothing operationally, because knowing that the Borg were coming and being able to stop the Borg from coming were different problems entirely, and no individual mind, however remarkable, could solve the second one. She had not anticipated 7 of 9. Not because 7 was unexpected aboard Voyager. The Queen was thoroughly aware of Seven's presence and history and had, on 2 previous occasions, attempted to re-establish her connection to the collective with results that had been instructive if not successful. She had not anticipated 7 as a variable in the specific configuration that was now developing, because the configuration required something she had not modeled. The willingness of a former drone to deliberately interface with Borg tactical systems from outside the collective in collaboration with a mind the collective had never encountered before. She became aware of it when her cube's secondary sensor array detected an unusual signal originating from Voyager's astrometrics laboratory. It was not a weapon. It was not a communication. It was a query. Specifically, a precise algorithmic query directed at the cube's external data interface in the specific machine language of Borg intervessel communication protocols, the language that drones use to share information across the collective's network, the language that no non-Borg entity should have known with sufficient precision to deploy correctly. Seven knew it. Of course Seven knew it. Seven had spent 18 years as a drone and carried the language in her rebuilt neural pathways the way humans carried their first language, not as learned knowledge but as something prior to learning, something that lived below the level of choice. The query was elegant. It was also, the Queen recognized after 0.003 seconds of analysis, a distraction. She redirected her primary attention immediately and found what she had missed. A second signal, smaller, buried in the sensor noise generated by Voyager's shield harmonics, operating in a frequency band that the cube's automated systems had classified as electromagnetic background radiation because it was indistinguishable from electromagnetic background radiation unless you knew. Specifically, precisely, with the kind of knowledge that came from having read 6 years of Borg tactical engagement data and cross-referenced it with the electromagnetic output profiles of Borg sensor arrays, exactly what pattern to look for. Someone had spent 72 hours learning how Borg sensors worked well enough to hide a signal inside their blind spot. The Queen experienced something she had not experienced in a very long time. It was not quite surprise, because surprise required an expectation being violated, and she had maintained enough uncertainty about this organism that she had not formed a specific expectation. It was something closer to what individuated species called recognition, the moment when a model you have been building of another mind suddenly becomes three-dimensional and starts moving on its own. She was interested. In Voyager's astrometrics laboratory, Ender and Seven worked in the specific focused silence of two people who understood that the quality of their concentration in the next 30 minutes would determine whether everyone on the ship lived or died, and who had therefore stopped using words for anything that could be communicated without them. Seven operated the Borg interface with the fluid precision of someone accessing a native language, her fingers moving across the modified console with a speed and accuracy that no human who hadn't spent 18 years as a drone could have matched. She was not attempting to hack the collective, that was not the plan and would not have worked regardless. She was doing something considerably more sophisticated. She was feeding the cube's tactical assessment systems a stream of behavioral data about Ender that was entirely accurate and entirely useless. Every piece of information she transmitted was true. His age, his biology, his training history, his performance metrics from battle school, the tactical simulations he had run in the 3 days since arriving on Voyager. All of it accurate. All of it selected, with the precision that came from Ender having spent the last 6 hours telling her exactly which true things to tell them, to produce a predictive model of his behavior that was comprehensive, coherent, and wrong in exactly one critical way. It modeled him as a reactive tactician. Someone who responded to threats with countermeasures. Someone who, when faced with a superior force, would look for the defensive solution. The shield adjustment, the weapon modification, the evasive maneuver that bought time. Someone who played not to lose. The hidden signal was doing something else entirely. Ender had his hands on a console that Seven had modified over the previous 4 hours into something that Voyager's engineering database had no category for. A hybrid interface that combined the deflector array's spatial geometry controls with the Astrometrics Lab's long-range sensor suite and a navigational subsystem that Seven had quietly restructured to give it capabilities it had not had before. He was not watching the Borg cube on his display. He was watching the region of space behind the Borg cube, in the direction from which it had come, and he was watching it with the expression of someone waiting for a calculation to resolve. "They've accepted the behavioral data," Seven said quietly. "How long before their predictive model is fully loaded?" "4 minutes, 17 seconds. The model requires complete integration before the Queen will commit to a tactical approach. She will not act on partial information. That's the gap, Ender said. Right there. She waits for complete information. She won't move until she's certain. He made an adjustment to his console. Has she detected the secondary signal? 7 paused for a fraction of a second, the pause of someone checking a reading they weren't sure they were interpreting correctly. Yes. Approximately 90 seconds ago. Good. 7 looked at him. Good. She was supposed to detect it. If she hadn't found it by now, it would mean she wasn't looking carefully enough, which would mean the behavioral model hadn't convinced her I was worth her full attention. He didn't look up from his console. She needed to find the hidden signal so she'd know I was operating at a level worth taking seriously. So she'd commit to the engagement personally instead of delegating to automated systems. 7 was quiet for a moment, processing this. You hid a signal for her to find, she said. So that finding it would give her confidence in her assessment of your capabilities. So that she would engage personally. A pause. So that she would be in the decision loop when you execute the actual strategy. The enemy's gate is down, Ender said quietly. It sounded like something he had said many times before, in different rooms, in the dark before battles that he had always already won by the time they started. I don't understand that reference, 7 said. It means the frame of reference you're given isn't the one that matters. He made the final adjustment to his console. The Borg Queen is modeling me as someone who will try to defend Voyager. She's right that I'll defend Voyager. She's wrong about how. He looked at the display, at the spatial geometry of the region behind the Borg cube, where his calculations had been pointing for the last 6 hours. The 3 species 8472 vessels are still holding position at 3.94 light-years. They've been observing the Borg cube since it dropped out of warp. They haven't moved because they're recalibrating. A Borg cube in proximity to Voyager changes their threat assessment significantly. He finally looked at 7 directly. What does species 8472 do when they encounter the Borg? 7's expression shifted into something that was not quite realization because it was moving too fast to settle into any single emotion. They attack, she said. Immediately and without assessment. The Borg are the only species for which they abandon their standard evaluation protocol. The Borg attempted to invade fluidic space and species 8472 responded with a campaign of total annihilation. They do not evaluate Borg threats. They eliminate them. They haven't attacked yet, Ender said. Because the cube's attention is directed at Voyager. Species 8472's threat calculation is based on vectors. A Borg vessel pointed at a different target is a Borg vessel that isn't pointed at them, Ender finished. Which changes their attack threshold geometry. He looked at the display. But if the cube were to redirect its tactical array toward the region of space they're occupying, even briefly, even as a targeting scan rather than an attack, it would register as a direct threat vector, 7 said slowly. And they would respond. In approximately how long? 7 calculated. From threat vector detection to weapons range, given their current position and acceleration capability, 11 minutes, 40 seconds. The cube's transporter cycle for a targeted biosignature extraction through a tachyon resonance pathway, how long from initiation to completion? 14 minutes, 22 seconds. Ender looked at her steadily. 7 looked back at him. And then, for the first time since Ender had come aboard Voyager, something happened in her face that was entirely and unambiguously human, a slow, quiet, wondering expression that had no tactical function and no strategic purpose and existed purely because she had just watched a mind do something she had not seen a mind do before. You are not trying to stop the Borg from taking you, she said. No. You are going to allow them to initiate the extraction sequence. And while they are committed to a 14-minute transporter cycle that requires their tactical array to be focused on a precise biosignature lock, she paused, you will redirect the cube's external sensor array, through the interface I have established with their tactical systems, to emit a targeting scan in the direction of the species 8472 vessels. A targeting scan in the exact frequency band that species 8472 identifies as a pre-attack sensor sweep, Ender said. Using the Borg's own sensor language, transmitted through the Borg's own array, so that when species 8472 detects it, they will have no reason to question that it is exactly what it appears to be. And while the Borg cube is committed to the extraction cycle and cannot break off without losing the biosignature lock. 3 ships that have destroyed Borg cubes before will cross 3.94 light-years in 11 minutes and 40 seconds, Ender said. And the Borg Queen will have to choose between completing the extraction and defending against an attack she did not predict and cannot stop in time. He looked at the display one final time. She built a predictive model of someone who plays not to lose. She didn't build a model of someone who designed the entire engagement so that the winning move was one she couldn't see until it was already executing. The console chimed softly. The Borg cube's transporter systems had just initiated a biosignature lock. 14 minutes, 22 seconds. Ender looked at Seven. Now, he said. Seven's hands moved across the interface with the precision of someone who had spent 18 years learning the collective's language and was now, for the first time, using it to say something the collective had never been told before. 3.94 light-years away, 3 ships that had come from beyond the dimensional boundary of normal space detected a targeting scan in the precise frequency of a Borg pre-attack sweep and responded the only way they knew how to respond to the Borg. Immediately. Without assessment. With everything they had. In the astrometrics lab, Ender sat back from the console and watched the display as the geometry of the engagement shifted into the configuration he had built it toward, and his expression was the expression of someone who had just closed a proof, not triumphant, not relieved, but quietly certain in the way of a mind that had known the answer before the question was finished being asked. Somewhere in the distributed consciousness of the Borg collective, the Queen looked at what was happening and understood, for the first time in longer than most civilizations had existed, that she had not been playing the game she thought she was playing. She had been playing his. The Borg Queen did not panic. Panic was a biological response rooted in the amygdala's threat assessment circuitry, a cascade of neurochemical signals that evolution had designed for organisms that needed to make survival decisions faster than conscious thought could manage. The Queen had no amygdala in the conventional sense. She had something older and stranger. A distributed threat response architecture woven through 11,000 active drones and the cold, comprehensive memory of 4,000 assimilated species, all of it converging in her focal consciousness with the speed of a computer and the depth of a civilization. She did not panic. But she recalculated. The recalculation took 1.4 seconds, which was, by the standards of the Borg collective, an eternity. It was the 4 seconds of a consciousness that had encountered a situation its predictive models had not accounted for and was running every available algorithm simultaneously trying to find the response that preserved the primary objective. The primary objective was Andrew Wiggin. The tactical situation was 3 species 8472 vessels crossing 3.94 light-years at maximum acceleration, 11 minutes and 31 seconds from engagement range, while the cube's transporter systems were committed to a biosignature extraction cycle that required 12 minutes and 57 seconds to complete and could not be interrupted without losing the lock entirely. The math was not in her favor. She knew it immediately and completely, and with the specific quality of knowing that came from being a consciousness that had never before encountered a situation where the math was not in her favor and did not entirely know what to do with the experience. She had 2 options. She could break the extraction cycle, redirect the tactical array to defensive posture against the species 8472 approach, and engage 3 vessels whose weapons had destroyed Borg cubes before. The engagement outcome was not certain, 3 vessels against 1 cube was not the overwhelming force that had driven the Borg from fluidic space, and the Queen had tactical responses to species 8472 weapons that individual cubes had developed through painful accumulated experience. She might win. She would certainly take damage. And she would leave without Wiggin, which meant the primary objective was lost, and the loss could not be recovered because a mind that had just demonstrated this level of strategic architecture would not be caught the same way twice. She could complete the extraction cycle and accept the species 8472 attack against a cube whose tactical array was committed to a transporter lock and therefore operating at significantly reduced defensive capacity for the next 12 minutes and 49 seconds. She might still win. The Borg were not without passive defensive capability, and the cube's hull could absorb considerable damage. But species 8472's weapons operated on a biokinetic principle that bypassed conventional shielding, and 3 vessels attacking simultaneously at a target that couldn't maneuver freely presented a damage probability that the Queen's tactical algorithms assessed at a level she was not willing to accept. There was no third option. She had checked. This was new. This was entirely and profoundly new. For the first time in longer than most species had possessed written language, the Borg Queen looked at a tactical situation and found that every available path had been anticipated and closed by someone else before she arrived at it. She looked, through the cube's sensor array, at the small Federation vessel holding position 0.7 light-years away. At the biosignature of the boy whose mind had just done this to her. And she did something that the collective's 4,000 years of operational history contained no prior record of. She hailed him directly. Not Voyager. Not Janeway. Him. On Voyager's bridge, Janeway watched the tactical display with the controlled attention of a woman who was tracking 6 variables simultaneously and refusing to show the effort it cost. The species 8472 vessels were at 3.1 light-years and accelerating. The Borg cube was holding position, its transporter system still active according to Tuvok's sensor readings, which meant the extraction cycle was still running, which meant either the plan was working or something had changed in the last 4 minutes that she didn't have visibility on. "Captain," Kim said, from Ops. "I'm getting a direct communication from the Borg cube. It's not the standard assimilation broadcast. It's..." He paused, checking his reading with the expression of a man who had learned not to trust his first read on anything in the Delta Quadrant. "It's addressed to astrometrics. Specifically to the secondary console." "To Andrew," Janeway said. "Yes, sir." She was out of her chair immediately. "Tuvok, you have the bridge. Maintain defensive posture. Do not fire on the cube unless it moves to intercept Voyager." She was already moving. "And Tuvok. If the species 8472 vessels reach engagement range before I'm back, the call is yours." Tuvok nodded once, which was everything. She reached astrometrics in 90 seconds, moving through corridors where crew members stood at alert stations with the specific posture of people who had decided not to be afraid and were doing a reasonable job of it. The door opened and she took in the room in a glance. 7 still at the interface console, her hands no longer moving, her attention redirected to the communication that was now resolving on the main astrometrics display. Ender standing in the center of the room with his arms at his sides and an expression on his face that Janeway had not seen before. Not the strategic calm. Not the contained assessment. Something older and harder and more honest than either of those, the expression of someone who had prepared extensively for a battle and was now standing at the edge of a different kind of engagement entirely, one for which preparation was less useful than presence. On the main display, the Borg Queen looked out at them. She was, Janeway thought, exactly as disturbing as every prior encounter had suggested. The pale architecture of her face, half biological and half technological, carrying the specific quality of something that had moved beyond the concerns of individual existence into a relationship with its own consciousness that had no human analog. Her eyes, when they found Ender, had the quality of a precision instrument finding its target. "Andrew Wiggin," she said. Her voice was the layered harmonic of the collective, individual and multiple simultaneously, the sound of a single throat speaking with the weight of 11,000 minds behind it. Yes, Ender said. You constructed this engagement to force a choice between primary objective and tactical survival. Yes. You anticipated both available options and closed them before I identified them. Yes. The Queen was quiet for a moment. On the tactical display at the edge of Janeway's peripheral vision, the species 8472 vessels were at 2.4 light-years. I want to understand how you did it, the Queen said. Janeway watched something move through Ender's expression at those words, recognition, complicated and not entirely comfortable. She suspected he had heard a version of that sentence before. She suspected it had been followed, in a previous life, by consequences. No, he said. The Queen's expression didn't change. You are aware that I can complete the extraction despite the tactical complications. The probability of success has decreased, but it has not reached zero. I'm aware, Ender said. You're aware that completing the extraction at reduced tactical capacity against a species 8472 attack has a damage probability you've already decided is unacceptable, or you would have completed it rather than hailing me. He looked at her steadily. You hailed me because you want something you can't take. Which means we're negotiating. Janeway placed herself at the edge of the conversation without entering it, the specific stillness of a captain who understood when someone else needed to be in front. The Queen looked at Ender for a long moment with the expression of something that was accustomed to having everything and was experiencing, with considerable clarity, the novelty of wanting something it couldn't acquire by force. What do you want? The Queen asked. For you to leave, Ender said. This ship, this crew, this region of space. Permanently. No return to Voyagers heading for the duration of their journey to Earth. That is not a negotiation. That is a demand. Yes, Ender said. It is. Another silence. The species 8472 vessels were at 1.9 light-years. The cube's transporter systems were still active, the extraction cycle still running, and the Queen was making a calculation that Janeway could see in the quality of her stillness, the calculation of a consciousness that had never before been in a position where accepting a demand was the rational choice. In exchange, the Queen said. In exchange, Ender said, I'll tell you what you actually want to know. Not how I constructed the engagement. That's a tactic. You can reconstruct tactics from sensor data. He paused. You want to know why your predictive model failed. What the gap is. Where it is in your architecture and why it exists. He held her gaze. That's worth more to you than my mind in the collective. Because my mind in the collective gives you one instance of what I can do. Understanding the gap gives you the ability to close it yourself. The Queen was very still. You would tell me this voluntarily, she said. Without assimilation. Yes. Why? Ender took a breath. And Janeway, watching him, saw the thing that she had seen in glimpses over 3 days. The thing underneath the strategic architecture and the trained precision and the carefully maintained surface of competence. The thing that Tuvok had found in the meld and had called a wait. It was there in his face now, fully present, undisguised, and it was not what she had expected. It was grief. Old grief. The kind that had been carried so long it had become structural, not a wound but a load-bearing element, something the whole edifice was built around. Because the Formics were a hive mind, he said quietly. And I understood them well enough to destroy them. And I have spent every day since then wondering if there was a version of that story where understanding led somewhere other than extinction. He looked at the Queen directly, and his voice was even and clear and carried no plea in it, only honesty delivered without flinching. You are a collective consciousness. You are not the Formics. But you are the closest thing in this universe to what they were. And if there is a version of this where understanding you leads somewhere other than a battle neither of us needs to have, I would rather find that version. A pause. That's why. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. The species 8472 vessels were at 1.4 light-years. On the edge of the tactical display, the Borg cube's transporter systems powered down. The extraction cycle terminated. The Queen looked at Ender for a moment that had a different quality from all the moments before it, not the assessment of a predator examining prey, not the calculation of a strategist examining a variable, but something closer to what Janeway would have called, in a human face, seeing. The gap, the Queen said, exists because the collective processes what is. Not what might be chosen. Yes, Ender said. And you process what might be chosen. I process everything, he said. What is, what was, what might be, and what someone might choose if they understood their own situation differently than they currently do. All of it simultaneously. Not because I'm exceptional. Because I was trained to, starting at an age when the training shapes the architecture rather than sitting on top of it. He paused. The gap isn't a flaw in the collective. It's the cost of certainty. You know so much that you model the future as a function of the past. And most of the time, that works. But occasionally someone comes along who understands that the model is the vulnerability, and builds their strategy around the space between what you know and what you're willing to consider. The Queen was silent for a moment. Then she said, with the specific quality of a consciousness filing information in a category it is still constructing, you are telling me this knowing that I will use it. Yes, Ender said. Because what I'm telling you is true but not sufficient. You can know the gap exists and still not close it, because closing it requires the collective to hold uncertainty as a permanent operational state rather than a temporary one pending more information. And the collective is not built for uncertainty. It is built for assimilation, for converting the unknown into the known, continuously, without pause. He looked at her steadily. Knowing where the gap is doesn't close it. It just means you know where you're vulnerable. Which is, in my experience, more useful than not knowing. The Queen regarded him in silence for 4 seconds. Then she said, Voyager will not be engaged by Borg assets on its current heading. For the duration of its journey. And the species 8472 vessels, Ender said. The Queen looked at him with an expression that was almost, in some deeply alien way, amused. That, she said, is outside my authority. No it isn't, Ender said. The Borg have an existing non-aggression arrangement with species 8472 in this region. It was established after the fluidic space incursion and it covers transit corridors. Voyager's current heading passes through 3 of them. Another silence. The arrangement will be extended to include Voyager's vessel class, the Queen said, and the words had the quality of something being added to a record that would not be revisited. Thank you, Ender said. It was such a simple thing to say. Janeway had expected something else. A tactical acknowledgement, a formal close of negotiations, something that matched the scale of what had just happened. Instead he said thank you, quietly and directly, the way you said it to someone who had done something difficult and chosen well, and for just a moment something moved in the Borg Queen's face that Janeway could not name and did not try to. The communication ended. The display went dark. In the space outside, the Borg cube held position for 11 seconds. The 11 seconds during which the species 8472 vessels reached 0.8 light-years and began their deceleration arc, responding to a signal from the cube that Tuvok later identified as the specific frequency of the non-aggression arrangement's extension protocol. Then the cube turned, reoriented on a heading away from Voyager's course, and accelerated into warp. In 37 seconds it was gone. The astrometrics lab was very quiet. Seven stood at her console with her hands still and her eyes on the space where the Queen's face had been, and her expression had the quality that Janeway had come to recognize in her most unguarded moments, the expression of someone who had once been part of something enormous and had chosen to leave it and still carried, in the deepest parts of herself, the complexity of that choice. Ender stood in the center of the room and said nothing for a long time. His arms were at his sides. The strategic calm was still there, the trained surface, but underneath it Janeway could see the thing that had been there when he spoke to the Queen, the grief that was also a kind of hope, the understanding that carried the weight of what understanding had cost before. She walked to stand beside him and they looked together at the empty display for a moment. "The Formix," she said quietly. "Not a question." "I understood them," he said. "In the end. Too late, but I understood them." He was quiet for a moment. They weren't monsters. They were something that had never encountered individual consciousness before. They didn't know what they were destroying in the first invasions. They didn't understand that we were people until it was already too late for the understanding to matter. He paused. "And then I made sure it was too late." Janeway was quiet. There was nothing to say to that which wouldn't diminish it, and she had enough respect for what he carried to let it be what it was. "You found a different version today," she said finally. He looked at her. And she saw it happen in his face, not healing, because some things didn't heal, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that it was possible, at least once, to understand something vast and strange and threatening and arrive somewhere other than its destruction. "I found a different version today," he said. Outside, the three species 8472 vessels held at 0.8 light-years for 47 seconds. Then they turned and accelerated away, back toward the dimensional boundary, back toward the space beyond space where they had come from, and Voyager's sensors tracked them until they were gone. Then there was only open space ahead. Stars and distance and 70,000 light-years of Delta Quadrant between this ship and home, and for the first time in as long as Janeway could remember, the path through it looked, if not clear, then at least unblocked. She tapped her comm badge. "Janeway to bridge. Stand down red alert. Set course for home, best sustainable speed." She paused. "Good work, everyone." She looked at Ender one more time. He was already thinking about something else. She could see it in his eyes, the simulations running, the patterns forming, the mind that had been built for this and had never, not once, known how to stop. She made a note to talk to the doctor about that. About what it meant to be a mind like his in a body that still needed sleep and food and the ordinary maintenance of being human. But not tonight. Tonight, Voyager moved through the dark toward home, and in the astrometrics lab, a boy who had ended one war and declined to start another stood in the starlight and thought. The days after the Borg encounter had a different quality than the days before it. Janeway had commanded Voyager for 4 years in the Delta Quadrant and she had developed, through long experience, an accurate internal barometer for the emotional weather of her ship. She knew the specific atmosphere of a crew under sustained threat. The tightness in corridors, the way conversations shortened and humor became either more frequent or more absent depending on the person, the particular quality of attention that people paid to their consoles when they were watching for something they hoped wouldn't come. She knew the atmosphere of a crew that had just survived something. The exhale that moved through 143 people simultaneously, the loosening of posture, the way the mess hall got louder and the holodeck request queue filled up within hours. What she felt in the days after was something she didn't have a precise name for. Not relief exactly, though relief was present. Not triumph, though that was present too in the understated way of people who had learned not to celebrate too loudly in a quadrant that had a habit of following good news with bad. It was something closer to recalibration. The sense of a crew that had been handed a new variable and was quietly, collectively, in the way that crews did these things without explicit discussion, deciding what to do with it. The variable was Ender. He had been aboard for 11 days when Janeway called the senior staff meeting she had been building toward since the morning he arrived. She had been deliberate about the timing, not so soon that the Borg encounter's immediacy would color the conversation, not so late that the absence of a decision had become itself a kind of decision. 11 days was enough time for her officers to have formed considered opinions. It was also, she suspected, enough time for Ender to have formed considerable opinions of his own, which was relevant because the meeting was as much for him as about him, and she had told him so when she invited him. He arrived before everyone else and sat at the far end of the briefing room table with a cup of something the replicator had produced at his request that was not quite coffee and not quite tea, and which the doctor had apparently approved as nutritionally acceptable with reservations. He had a PADD in front of him. He was not reading it. He was, Janeway suspected, running simulations about how the meeting would go and what the possible outcomes were and what each outcome meant for the various parties, because that was what his mind did with available time, and she had stopped expecting it not to. Torres arrived next, with the specific energy of someone who had been thinking hard about something for 11 days and had finally organized her thoughts into a shape she was prepared to defend. Then Chakotay, then Kim, then Paris with a cup of actual coffee that he offered to Ender with the casual friendliness that was Tom Paris's most genuine quality and which Ender accepted with a nod that meant more than it looked like. 7 arrived precisely on time, which meant she had been waiting outside the door for whatever interval had elapsed between her arrival and the exact scheduled start. Tuvok arrived 4 seconds before the scheduled start, which was, for Tuvok, practically late, and suggested he had been occupied with something that had required a decision about prioritization. The doctor arrived via the wall panel's holographic emitter, which he had insisted on as a point of professional dignity, and took a position standing at the side of the room with the bearing of a man who had opinions and intended to share them in order. Janeway looked around the table. 11 days ago, she said, a slipstream test brought an unexpected passenger aboard this ship. Since then, that passenger has identified a species 8472 surveillance pattern our senior staff missed, proposed a theoretical correction to our slipstream drive geometry that engineering is currently modeling, established a non-aggression communication with a species we've never been able to communicate with before, and negotiated a safe passage agreement with the Borg Collective that covers our entire remaining journey home. She paused. I want to discuss what happens next. And I want Andrew in this conversation rather than subject to it. She looked at Ender. He met her eyes with the expression she had come to think of as his listening face, alert, present, giving nothing away and missing nothing. The floor is open, she said. Torres went first, because Torres always went first when she had something technical to say and considered the social order of speaking secondary to the operational efficiency of getting the information out. The slipstream correction works, she said, with the directness of someone who had spent 11 days hoping it wouldn't so she could stop feeling unsettled by it. 7 and I have run the simulations 47 times. The wave-riding approach to field coherence is theoretically sound and the preliminary models show a 340% improvement in sustainable corridor duration. We haven't tested it physically yet because I want 3 more weeks of simulation data before I'm willing to stake the ship on it. But it works. She looked at Ender. How did you know? I didn't, Ender said. I recognized that the failure pattern was inconsistent with the theory you were operating from, which meant the theory had a gap. I proposed the correction that the failure pattern implied. You verified it. He paused. The verification was the hard part. I couldn't have done that. Torres looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to be satisfied with that answer. She apparently decided yes, because she sat back. Chakotay spoke next, with the measured thoughtfulness that was his characteristic register. I want to raise the question that I think is present in this room whether we name it or not, he said. Andrew is 17 years old. He has no family in this century, no home, no institutional support structure, no legal status within the Federation framework, and no way back to his own time or his own universe. The question of what we do with that situation is not a tactical question. It's a human one. The room was quiet in the way rooms were quiet when someone had said the true thing that everyone was thinking. Ender looked at Chakotay with an expression that was complicated in ways Janeway couldn't fully read, recognition, maybe, and something that was not quite gratitude but lived close to it. The acknowledgement that someone had named his situation accurately and without softening it. I've thought about it, Ender said. I know you have, Chakotay said. I'm asking what you've thought. Ender was quiet for a moment. He looked at the PADD in front of him, then set it aside with the deliberate movement of someone choosing to put their prepared notes away and speak from something less organized and more honest. I was on my way to being relocated when the fold brought me here, he said. The if was moving me to a colony posting. Something quiet, somewhere I wasn't a political complication. They'd gotten what they needed from me and they were managing the remainder. He said it without bitterness, which was somehow more affecting than bitterness would have been. My sister Valentine was the only person who would have noticed I was gone. And she would have been told it was a routine transfer. A pause. So the honest answer to what I've lost is, not very much. Not the way it sounds. And what you found? Chakotay asked. Ender looked around the table. At Torres, who had spent 11 days being unsettled by him and had just admitted, in her own language, that unsettled was not the same as wrong. At Seven, whose eyes held the specific quality of recognition that came from someone who understood what it was to have been used by an institution and to be figuring out who you were in the aftermath of that. At Tuvok, who had walked through the most defended territory in his mind and kept the confidence of it without being asked. At Paris, who had offered him coffee with no ulterior motive, which was such a small thing and had landed, Janeway suspected, with more weight than Paris knew. At Chakotay, who had named his situation truthfully. At the doctor, who had asked him to lie down 7 times and was now composing what appeared to be a formal objection to something on his PADD but was in fact, Janeway had learned to recognize, his way of paying very close attention while maintaining the pretense of being occupied. At Janeway, who had come to sickbay armed and sat on a backwards chair and told him the truth about needing him without making it sound like ownership. I found a crew that's trying to get home, he said. And I don't have a home to get to. Which means I have the rarer thing. He looked at Janeway. I have somewhere to go instead. Janeway held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at her senior staff. The people who had kept this ship alive for 4 years in the hardest quadrant in the galaxy, who had built something in the dark that had no right to be as good as it was, who had never once, in 4 years of being 70,000 light-years from everything they knew, stopped being the people she needed them to be. Any objections to Andrew joining this crew on a permanent basis pending our return to Federation space, she asked. Paris raised his coffee cup. Torres made a sound that was technically not an endorsement but functionally was. Chakotay nodded with the warmth of someone who had advocated for this before it was asked. Seven said nothing, but the quality of her silence was the quality of someone who had already made their decision 11 days ago and was waiting for the official record to catch up. Tuvok said, with the precision of a man who had given this considerable thought, his tactical and analytical contributions to crew safety have been demonstrable and significant. His integration into the crew's operational structure appears to be proceeding without complication. I have no objection. The doctor said, with some feeling. I have 17 objections of a medical and developmental nature relating to the welfare of an adolescent in an active combat environment, all of which I have documented in a report I will be submitting to the captain, and none of which change my fundamental position that Andrew Wiggin should remain aboard this vessel under appropriate medical supervision, which I intend to provide whether or not anyone asks me to. Everyone looked at the doctor. That's a yes, Paris said. That is emphatically a yes, the doctor confirmed. Ender looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up, and Janeway saw something in his face that she had not seen there before in 11 days, not the strategic calm, not the contained assessment, not the grief that was also a hope. Something simpler and more fundamental. The expression of a person who has been, for the first time in their memory, in a room full of people who were choosing to be on their side without being required to. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The meeting moved on to the slipstream simulations, which Torres had strong opinions about, and then to the implications of the Species 8472 communication for Voyager's remaining course options, which Ender and Seven had jointly prepared a recommendation on. And then to a scheduling question about holodeck time that Paris had apparently been waiting for an appropriate moment to raise for 2 weeks. Ordinary things. The business of a ship that was trying to get home. After the meeting, Ender stayed behind as the others filed out, which Janeway noticed and waited for. When they were alone in the briefing room with the stars moving slowly past the viewport and the ship humming around them with the ordinary sounds of a crew going about its day, he stood and looked at the viewport for a moment. "The slipstream correction," he said. "If the simulations hold and Torres clears it for a physical test, what does that do to your timeline?" Janeway had already run the numbers. "If the wave-riding approach delivers anything close to what the models show, we could reduce the journey from 60 years to somewhere between 8 and 12, depending on corridor stability and recharge intervals." He nodded slowly. "So there are people alive on Earth right now who will still be alive when you arrive?" "For most of my crew, yes." She watched him. "For you it means something different." "Valentine," he said quietly. She'd be in her late 80s. Maybe 90s. He was quiet for a moment. "She might be alive." Janeway said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would be more useful than silence. "She wrote to me," he said. "When I was at battle school. Letters they eventually stopped delivering because Graf thought they were a distraction. I memorized every one before they stopped. He paused. I still have them. In here." He touched his temple briefly, an unguarded gesture, the kind that appeared when the train's surface was at rest. "She signed every one the same way. Your loving sister, Val. Even when she was angry at me. Even when I'd done something she didn't approve of." He looked at the stars. "She would have been told I died in transit. She's been grieving me for however long it's been." Janeway looked at the stars with him for a moment. "When we get home," she said carefully, "there will be questions about your legal status, your identity, your historical origins. The Federation will want to talk to you at considerable length and some of that will not be comfortable. Section 31 may take an interest. Starfleet intelligence certainly will. There will be people who look at what you can do and want to do exactly what Graf did." "I know," Ender said. "I'll do everything in my power to prevent that." He looked at her. "I know that too." She smiled, briefly and genuinely. "Good." He picked up the PADD from the table and turned toward the door, and then paused with the quality of someone who had thought of a thing and decided to say it rather than keep it. "Captain. The enemy's gate is down. What I told Seven, when we were working on the Borg problem. I remember. It means the orientation you're given isn't necessarily the one that matters. The frame you're handed is just one way to look at things. The person who chooses their own frame, who decides what down means for themselves, already has an advantage before anything else starts." He looked at her with the steady dark eyes that had been reading rooms and people and tactical situations since before he could name what he was doing. "Graf gave me that. He taught me the principle that he then used against me. He framed everything as a game and I chose to believe it because I needed to believe it." A pause. "You gave me the same information Graf had and you let me choose my own frame. That's not a small thing." Janeway looked at him for a moment. "Go get some sleep, Andrew," she said. "The doctor has a report and I suspect it mentions sleep approximately 11 times. 14, he said. I read it this morning." He left. Janeway turned back to the viewport and the stars, and stood there for a while thinking about frames and orientations and the directions people chose for themselves when someone finally gave them the choice. She thought about a boy who had been built to end things and who had spent 11 days, in the particular crucible of this ship and this crew and this quadrant, discovering that the same mind that ended things could also, when pointed at the right problem with the right kind of trust behind it, find the version where things didn't have to end. She thought about Valentine Wiggin, 80-something years old on a planet 70,000 light-years away, who had been grieving her brother for however long it had been and didn't know yet that the universe had decided to send him back by an extremely indirect route. She picked up her coffee. Cold, as usual. She drank it anyway. In the weeks that followed, Andrew Wiggin became something that Voyager's journey had not previously included, a fixed point. Not in the navigational sense, but in the way that certain people become fixed points in the lives of the people around them, present, consistent, reliable in their particular way of being themselves. The slipstream correction moved through simulation into cautious physical testing and then, 3 months later, into a successful corridor run that shaved 4 years off the journey home in a single afternoon and left Torres standing in engineering with the expression of someone who has just watched a theory become real. The Species 8472 communication protocol, developed from Ender's initial contact framework, opened a channel of cautious nonverbal exchange that Janeway documented carefully for Starfleet, knowing that what she was sending home was something that would matter long after Voyager arrived. The Borg safe passage held. The Delta Quadrant, which had been trying to kill this crew for 4 years with dedicated consistency, did not stop being dangerous. But something had shifted in the tactical landscape around Voyager, a new respect, or perhaps something more complicated than respect, from entities that had now encountered the ship's newest crew member and updated their calculations accordingly. Ender studied. He learned the ship the way he had learned battle school. Completely, systematically, attending to every system and every person with the same quality of attention until Voyager existed in his mind as a fully operational model he could run simulations on in his sleep. He worked with 7 on a project neither of them talked about much but which Tuvok noted in his security log as a comprehensive tactical framework for nonviolent contact protocols with unknown species, rooted in the Species 8472 communication work and extending it into a generalizable methodology. He played 3-dimensional chess with Tuvok twice a week and won approximately 40% of the time, which Tuvok logged as noteworthy without elaboration. He ate meals in the mess hall with whatever combination of crew happened to be there and said little but listened with the focused presence of someone for whom other people were, always, the most interesting data in any room. He was not healed. That was not how it worked, and Janeway had enough experience with the weight people carried to know better than to measure progress in those terms. He still ran simulations in his sleep, according to the doctor's monitoring, and still carried the formics in the deepest room of his mind where they had lived since Eros. But he carried them differently than he had when he arrived, not as a debt with no currency to pay it, but as something closer to what Tuvok had suggested in astrometrics, on a day that felt both recent and very long ago, not just what it was, but what it had made him, and what he was choosing to make of that. Somewhere ahead, 70,000 light-years away and 8 years in the future at best sustainable speed, or considerably less, now, with a slipstream corridor and a wave-riding approach to field coherence that changed the geometry of the journey home. There was a planet where a woman named Valentine was growing old without knowing that her brother was alive in a century she hadn't been born to yet, moving toward her through the dark between stars at speeds that would have seemed impossible when she last wrote him a letter. The letter had ended, as they all ended, "Your loving sister, Val." He was going to make sure she got to say it again.